Okay, we are now going on to objective number 2, which is we're going to talk about the history of evolution and the impact of Charles Darwin. Now you need to understand that Charles Darwin, shown in his later years in this picture, was considered the father of evolution. It was somewhat controversial then because by and large people were creationists, believed that God created the earth in 6 days, so on and so forth. But the theory of evolution was totally different. A little bit of background on Charles Darwin. He was the second oldest in a very well-to-do family in England. And the way things worked back then is that the oldest son would wind up inheriting all the property. And usually the second son would go into the clergy. And he started with that. But he soon became dissatisfied with that. And because of his connections, he was able to go on the voyage of the Beagle. Now, the Beagle's voyage was a 5-year voyage to circumnavigate the Earth and travel to exotic locations to see what the flora and fauna was. And so he would bring back samples. He brought back thousands of samples. He was also a tremendous illustrator. If you think of the TV series Star Trek and the movies of Star Trek, it was the Star Trek Voyager or the Star Trek Enterprise was to go on a 5-year mission to places where no one had gone before. And so when you look at the whole Star Trek series, it was based or a parody of basically what happened on the voyage of the Beagle. So in 1831, and so we're going on almost 200 years ago, the HMS, which stands for His Majesty's Service, or it could be Her Majesty's Service, depending whether there was a king or a queen, it left on its 5-year mission. And of note is the Galapagos Island, which was about 750 miles off the coast of Ecuador, where they discovered a lot of interesting creatures. But anyway, we'll get to that in a second. As you can see, Charles Darwin was only 22 years old, and he was the one who collected thousands of plant and animal species. Because of his connections, because of his father, he was able to get everyone on the ship to accommodate him and his needs, and that was the primary purpose of the Beagle. He wrote all this information down. He didn't start off with a theory of evolution. He just wrote everything down and noticed some interesting phenomenon. And probably the most interesting was when they stopped in the Galapagos Islands, which was, as I said before, about 750 miles off the coast of Ecuador in South America. And it was there at the Galapagos Islands that he noticed birds, very small birds known as finches. And the Galapagos Islands are a series of different islands with different habitats and climates. And he found out that on one island, the finches would have one sort of a shape to their beak, and on another, totally different. And it said it seemed to differ based on the types of food that they were eating. So as you can see, the seed-eating species crack seeds with their beak, whereas the leaf-eating species rip the leaves apart. So the beaks looked different. He decided that over time that the finch beaks were adapted to the type of food they ate. And over millennia and over multiple generations of finches on these different islands, the ones that were most successful in surviving were the ones who had the beaks that were able to best harvest the food. It made him think, I wonder why and how they all became different. So he concluded that the beaks were adapted for the type of food they ate. And so grub-eating species would be able to probe the bark, so they had to penetrate the bark with its beak to get grubs. Cone-eating species had a really strange one, but basically used its beak to pull apart pine cones and lift the seeds out. So his hypothesis was, there must have been a common ancestor, and depending on what island they wound up going to, they wound up adapting, and over time they became different species with different beaks. Somehow the ancestral species, if you remember the cladogram, going all the way down, there had to be an original finch. How it got there, since it was so far away, certainly finches are not long distance flyers, so they figured perhaps they got stranded on a piece of driftwood, or they somehow, and we don't know exactly how, they wound up on the Galapagos Islands. And then, of course, once they got there, they could fly from island to island. And as each group of finches became isolated from the other groups, they ultimately became their own species, which meant that they could not reproduce with each other. They would be, number one, they wouldn't be interested any more than a human would be interested in a chimpanzee. And of course, there was nothing to force this. So we forced the mating of donkeys and horses to create mules, which have the best properties of both, but mules are born sterile, and therefore they cannot reproduce. So Darwin's theory was published in a book called On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. Notice he got back from his trip in 1836. It was 23 years before he produced this landmark book. Part was because he knew it was going to be very controversial, and he was still a young man when he came back, and he had not developed the international reputation. So once he had the reputation and he had all the facts, he was able to publish this book, and it was not discarded. Anyway, based on his research and his evidence, he concluded that, number one, organisms change over time. Number two, all organisms are descended from common ancestors by a process of branching. Number three, evolution is gradual. It takes a long time for this to happen. Eons, thousands, tens of thousands of years. And the mechanism of evolution is natural selection, which we will